Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Family Fridays. This is just where we're trying to resource you and help you at home as we're in the midst of the pandemic. Today, I'm excited for what our topic. I think it's something that is relevant to a lot of Duchenne families. I know to my own family. We're talking about learning challenges at home. As we know, for the Duchenne population, learning disorders are more common. And so, what we're going to talk about today is how to maybe identify if you're seeing some, or also if you already know that your child has some learning challenges, how are you managing that? I know for me, I've been able to kind of see being at home with my child with Duchenne, maybe some of the struggles that I didn't see before in the same way, just because we're at home all day. And even though we knew he has learning challenges, but just kind of seeing how he learns and things like that has been insightful for me and caused me to ask some new questions. So maybe that's happening for you as well. So today we are welcoming a couple of people. One is actually my husband, James Boyski, and it's his birthday today. So if you want to say happy birthday in the comments, feel free. And I think he's like, 22 or something. And then my good friend Steph Killian. She is the Connect coordinator, one of them for North Texas, and she has 5 kids and one son with Duchenne. And so she's just going to share kind of her struggles, challenges, and some things that have worked as she's been working with her Duchenne son at home. So we're going to start with James just to give us a little bit of what if you've been seeing some things and you're wondering, does my child have some learning challenges? What should I be looking for? So, James, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yep. Okay. Can you hear me? Is this thing on? Sorry. It's been a long week. All right. In general, my experience has been that parents of kids who have Duchenne, they're probably a little bit more tuned in to learning and possible learning problems than most parents are. But I still think it's good to go over this stuff because, like you were saying, sometimes, just being at home with your kids, you start noticing stuff that even if you're kind of really on top of things, you may not have noticed before. And so thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of talk about some red flags and some things that we've been seeing, just so, people can kind of spot something if there's an issue. And in general, there is an increased risk for learning disorders when kids have Duchenne. And learning disorders they're problems learning a specific academic skill or specific academic area or subject. And they're not necessarily we wouldn't use that term to describe kind of broad-based problems learning everything. These are things that are really more specific to a certain subject. And the 3 main areas that people have problems in this regard are reading, writing, and math. And problems with reading are called dyslexia. That's the term that we use for that. And everybody's probably heard of that before. It shouldn't be anything new, but there's a common misconception that dyslexia is a visual problem, that people are seeing letters backwards or reversed or moving around on the page or that sort of thing. It's actually not true. It's really more of a problem with the sound aspect of reading. And so they can see it fine, but they have a hard time matching up the right sounds with what they see. Or being able to look at a word and break it down into the right sounds, blend the sounds together. Difficulty decoding words based on kind of that sound symbol relationship. And essentially that process is called phonics, right? Everybody's heard of Hooked on Phonics. They had a really good marketing campaign, I think probably about 15 years ago. Dyslexia is a deficit in phonics. And as a result of that, early on, oftentimes we can see where kids have difficulty learning letter names and letter sounds. It's like you'll go over it with them and go over it with them and go over it with them. And eventually they kind of got it, but then you try it the next day and it's like they've never seen it before. And we can also see problems in early elementary, such as kindergarten or first grade, with difficulty learning that decoding process, being able to break a word down, sound it out. And so there's a tendency for kids to just kind of look at the first letter or two and guess at the rest of a word, or they'll just take random guesses based on kind of what maybe the picture shows or something like that. And it can really be very laborious. And we can also see too where some people can have difficulty with reading fluency, where actually maybe in milder cases of dyslexia, they may actually develop fairly accurate word decoding, but they don't develop automaticity, which is making that process automatic. And so it's very laborious and sloppy and choppy, and it doesn't flow. They might kind of read right through punctuation, monotone, kind of no pauses or inflection or anything like that. And like I was saying, you can have mild cases and more pronounced cases. And so more severe cases, you might see problems in all of these areas that I'm talking about. In milder cases, it might really just kind of come out in relation to their reading fluency. Now, if you're exerting a lot of effort in understanding what the passage is indicating, obviously it takes away from your ability to kind of step back and analyze what the overall picture is of what you're reading. So it can also have an impact on reading comprehension. Now, problems in math are called dyscalculia, which I know it sounds really fancy and it's kind of a mouthful, but basically that means problems with math. And there's three main areas that kids can have problems in when it comes to math. One area is difficulty understanding math concepts. So what does it all mean? What's the gist of it? The symbolic aspect of math. So for example, understanding that fractions, decimals, and percentages, they're all the same thing. They're just expressed in different ways. It can also be related to having difficulty estimating value, or we call it having number sense. So for example, if I do 29 times 32, I might get 500 trillion and 7. Now, I might not know what the answer is, but I can eyeball that and I can know that I'm probably way off. Well, people who have difficulty with number sense, they can't do that. And so they might write down an answer and have no clue that they're not even close, and they just kind of move on to the next one. We can also see problems with things like money and telling time. And we can also see difficulty with word problems in terms of being able to kind of get the main point of what the word problem is wanting you to do, and being able to kind of filter out the non-essential stuff or the distracting stuff. The second area that we can see difficulty in math is difficulty remembering math operations. So the steps, which side do I start from? Which direction do I work when I'm working across this problem? Did I line my numbers up correctly? Some people believe that that's also related to having difficulty with an internal number line. So being able to kind of picture in your head a number line and count backwards if you have to. And people also relate this to also having difficulty with word problems in terms of making sure that we're arranging the numbers correctly when we finally decide what kind of operation the main problem is wanting us to do. The third area that kids can have difficulty in terms of math is difficulty memorizing basic math facts. So the addition table, subtraction table. And despite a lot of repetition, it's like it just doesn't sink in. And so they're guessing a lot, or they're counting on their fingers, or having to kind of rely on some other sort of system to try to figure it out. And similar to dyslexia, dyscalculia can have kind of a range of severity. And so you can have kids who have maybe milder aspects of it who might have problems in one of those areas. More severe cases might have problems in 2 or 3, all of those areas. So it just kind of depends. The third area, the third kind of learning disorder is called dysgraphia. And dysgraphia is problems with writing. And people use the term dysgraphia to mean a number of different things, and people don't always mean the same thing. And so I mentioned to people, it may depend on kind of who you're talking to and what their profession is or where you are in the country. So I'm going to kind of cover all of them, all of these kind of different things that dysgraphia might mean, just to kind of be comprehensive. But the most common use of the term dysgraphia is problems with fine motor pencil control, pencil movement, and difficulty learning to write letters accurately, neatly, and fluently, quickly. And so we can see problems with letter sizing and spacing, like it might be all different sizes or squished together. They might start writing letters in unconventional places. So like they'll start at the bottom when they're making a T, and they'll go up and then cross it. And in general, the writing tends to be slower and laborious. It's like painful. And you can also see kind of a lot of resistance to writing because it feels like it's so much effort. But the thing I want people to know is people with dysgraphia can write. The problem is it's just a lot harder and laborious for them. People can also have difficulty with things like spelling. Now, sometimes that's because they're having difficulty remembering spelling rules, but sometimes it can also be because of difficulty with that sound symbol connection, kind of like we would see in dyslexia, because reading is sound decoding. and spelling and sound encoding. And if you're having a problem with kind of the sound symbol connection, it's going to hit you both ways. We can also see some kids who have problems with things like grammar and sentence structure, punctuation, difficulty remembering capitalization, and sometimes, especially problems with grammar, those can be related to kind of an overall problem with language development. Sometimes things like remembering punctuation and capitalization, those can be related to attention problems. The last area that I'll mention when it comes to dysgraphia is, and I think this is probably an area that's most often overlooked by people, but we can see problems where we can see some kids who have problems with ideation, which is basically generating ideas, thinking of what to say, and being able to sequence their ideas in a way that makes sense and kind of flows and builds upon each aspect of what they're writing. And so these are kids who tend to kind of stare at a blank page and they say, I don't know what to say. And the more open-ended and unstructured the writing task is, or the expectations are, the more this is going to come out. And the problem is this is often interpreted as they're just not trying, or they're refusing to do it. And it's more interpreted as kind of like an oppositional behavior rather than as kind of a cognitive weakness. And I find that this becomes, well, you can see this in early elementary, but it becomes even more pronounced as they get older because the writing demands increase. And, you know, there's also, aside from specific learning problems, there's also a number of other areas that kids can have difficulty with that often kind of show up when you're around them a lot. And one area is, I think that's also tends to be overlooked, are problems with attention. And when I say problems with attention, it does mean like being distracted or off task or that sort of thing, but it also is related to procrastinating and putting it off as much as possible. And, you know, these are the kids who would complain about something longer than it would take just to get it done. Or, you know, kind of doing the bare minimum where the effort and the motivation, it's really hard to get them to do it. We can also see problems when kids have attention problems. We can also see difficulty with short-term memory or working memory, which is taking in new information, holding it in mind, and then being able to kind of step back and analyze it without losing it. And especially word problems require a lot of that, but other aspects of school do as well. And we can also see, you know, in general, I think this can be a problem, but in particular, kids who have Duchenne, the anxiety can get in the way too. I mean, I think in general, there's a greater chance that they can kind of be hardwired towards having some anxiety. And oftentimes that can also be a major impedance when you're working on stuff at home because they get worked up and stressed out and overload quickly. And it can be really hard for them to recover from that. It really kind of can be difficult for them to kind of be pragmatic and kind of problem solve and think about, okay, this is hard. How else am I going to do it? Or what's another way of coming up with this? And so it can result in a lot of shutting down or meltdowns or that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you, James. Those are all some good things to look for.
But they're not good to look for, but look for them. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So now I want to ask Stephanie to just share a little bit about kind of what her experience has been having school at home with her kids, and maybe some things that have worked, things that have not worked, some of the challenges and that sort of thing. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rachel. So fair disclosure here, I am a former teacher, taught many years ago, taught elementary school. It's really not helping at home with online school with my kids. I also feel like James has been peeking in my windows because he described a lot of the things that I've experienced and are going on with my kids at home. We have 3 kids at home right now. 2 are out of the house and grown adults. But one of them is a college student who's working on his own work, thankfully, and needs no help, and that's lovely. We have an 18-year-old son, Sam, that has Duchenne, and along with Duchenne, he also has ADHD and anxiety. That's a tough combination for him. He's academically high functioning, but he really struggles with executive function skills. He struggles with planning and he struggles with time management. And those are 2 things that would really be helpful for him with online school. He was motivated to sit down and work on his online assignments, but then his anxiety increased because he realized that he wasn't at school with his friends, and he wasn't able to, he was missing school. He's missing his senior year, and his anxiety just caused him to completely freeze, and then he couldn't get anything done. So it was really tough for him. One of the things that finally worked for him was he reached out to some of his teachers on Zoom meetings, and his English teacher, they sat down together and were able to take care of all of his assignments orally online together. And that really increased his confidence and allowed him to, work on some other things. So online school is not a good format for him. He really misses the people and misses the mental energy that he got from his peers and his teachers, but he's limping along with it. One of the silver linings for Sam, however, has been that his social life has taken off, and that's been a little bit touchy for him for a while, but his friends are all home now and they're not working anymore, and they don't have sporting events to go to, and they have more time on their hands. So they're online and able to talk and chat some more. We also have another child in second grade, Sophie, and I've noticed, I've suspected maybe there were some things going on with her, but I've been able to see some at home now, working with her, some learning differences. And what I've done with working with her is try to figure out what the task or what the teachers, what the teachers are trying to teach or test, and break that skill down. And for writing, is it really about the handwriting or is it about the content? And if that's the case, then I will usually let her dictate to me, and I'll either write it or type it. Now, there are other times when they're wanting them to do the writing because they're practicing punctuation and capitalization or revising and editing. But an 8-year-old, the hunt and peck method on typing on the computer takes so much longer. And if that's not the skill being taught, then there's no reason to do that. The other thing is, for her, she's supposed to read for 30 minutes every day. And while she enjoys reading, the thought of reading for 30 minutes is a little bit laborious. So she and I have been making that kind of a special time, and we find a fun place to read together, either on the swing outside or cuddled up with dogs. And then we read together, and that makes it more fun. So we're just trying to survive online school and protect mental health in our house. And it doesn't have to look pretty. We're just trying to get the job done.
Yeah.
Steph, I think you make a really good point. And I always tell people that if a kid is having difficulty in an area, you don't want to try to use schoolwork to make that area better necessarily. So I think if parents have any concerns about learning or that sort of thing, definitely kind of the first thing to do is get it checked out, get it evaluated, have an evaluation, just so you can identify what it is, you can document that and come up with like an intervention plan if needed. And the reason I say that is, obviously, if a kid is having a difficulty like this, it doesn't just go away. And, on one hand, we need to kind of think about short term and just getting this school year done. But also, longer term planning needs to take place too. Now, for like the immediate here and now, if a kid's having difficulty in an area like with writing, and say they have really poor penmanship and they have to do a writing task, but the task itself isn't about perfect handwriting, it's more about the content, like sentence structure or that sort of thing, then work around it to still allow the main task to happen, but without the area of difficulty getting in the way. So for example, if I have poor penmanship, but we have to write 2 sentences, just type it for them, or just write it for them while they're dictating to you. Also, if there's a task that's open-ended and unstructured and a kid has difficulty generating ideas, they have ideation, well, just provide more structure to that task and give them more ideas, help give specific step-by-step instructions in how to do that, and really walk them through that, so that they can still do the work, get it done, but they're not bogging down on their area of weakness, or their problem isn't what's getting in the way. So I always tell parents, feel free to modify tasks and homework and schoolwork as much as you need to allow it to get done. And in saying that, I'm not saying you have to do it for them. Obviously, that's not beneficial. But if they have an area of weakness that's getting in the way to the point where it's just taking forever to get it done and we're having tears and everybody's crying, then we're not learning anything at that point anyway. So do what you have to do. And in particular for this school year, I mean, I think it's really just a matter of just getting her done and doing whatever you got to do and modifying, providing as much help as you have to just to get through stuff. Um, I don't think we should really have high expectations for huge amounts of learning to occur for the rest of this year, because I don't think schools necessarily have that expectation. I think my impression has been, correct me if I'm wrong, my impression has been they're doing enough to finish out the school year, to feel like they're doing something to keep people engaged and keep people on board. But, they're not expecting to move the earth either. And so, sometimes shooting for good enough and kind of what's satisfactory rather than perfect is a good idea. The other thing too is I find oftentimes kids with Duchenne, well, any kid in general, but in particular kids with Duchenne, they do better, they do well in as much as you can have a routine that you follow every day. And it can be hard to do that, especially if you're working from home and you've got meetings and stuff that you have to do too. But in as much as you can kind of have the same pattern, the same routine, we're going to work on the same stuff at the same time, it can help. And if there's something where the kid has to be independent and they're not able to get it done, then you know what, maybe we need to just let that go today, or maybe you just need to provide more help so we can whip through it and not have to worry about it. I think too that kids are going to need more incentive. They're going to need more kind of rewards. They need kind of more of a light at the end of the tunnel. And so, I'm not always a fan of this, but in general, if you have to resort to bribery, then don't feel bad about that. Be strategic. Don't kind of give away the whole farm for a minor thing. But if you got to make it worth their while, don't hesitate to do that. Because again, we just got to get through the school year and get her done. And we can't get kind of too caught up in necessarily how we do that right now, I think.
Okay. Great. Thanks, James and Stephanie. I invite you all to send your questions into the comment section so we can kind of go through those. One question I wanted to pose to Stephanie right now, and then James can follow up, is how do you manage as we talked about, this isn't a learning challenge, but anxiety is so often something that occurs a lot in boys with Duchenne. Stephanie, how do you manage when just the anxiety gets high compiled with the learning issues? What are some tactics you have for reducing the anxiety so that some learning can happen?
Well, so Sam is 18 and he has decided that a switch flipped when he was 18 and he wants to be completely independent, which is lovely, except that he needs some support and lacks some skills that would help him be more successful with school. His anxiety was just so high, and anything that we were trying to do to help or support him seemed to increase his anxiety. So we've stepped back for him right now with the academics and are letting him handle them. And it's a learning experience for him to try to manage it. And is he doing 100%? No, but is he learning some skills that he might not otherwise learn? Yes, it's a calculated risk. His grades are not going to impact him negatively, we know, so he'll graduate. So we're really trying to step back and not add pressure. Talking to his teachers really helped him when he finally reached out, because he had made it such a big deal that he was in a hole. But when he finally reached out to them, he felt a real sense of relief, and they understood and were very supportive of him. One day it was a really hard day for everyone, and so we just didn't do any academics that day for anyone, and we just kind of did whatever and relaxed. We've been trying hard as a family to get outside every day, if not all together, then as individuals. We're trying to eat lunch outside sometimes, just different things that we wouldn't have done otherwise, but all of those are helping with the overall anxiety in our house.
And yeah, I think those are really good things. Um, I always tell parents that I think the biggest thing that we can do when we're seeing a kid start to freak out, basically, and this is probably the hardest thing to do, but as parents, I think that it's really important for the parent to stay calm and to not get caught up in it, and to not, kind of escalate things or kind of get agitated themselves, because that just fans the flames and it really ramps things up. And and it also makes it hard for us to kind of think through it and problem solve, and kind of, come up with a way of addressing the situation. So it's really important for us to check our emotional reactions as much as possible, which is really hard because that's kind of a natural human reaction. If things are getting tense, your body and mind respond to that. But if you can go into it saying to yourself, I'm going to be calm. He's probably going to start freaking out, but I'm going to be calm, and be intentional about that. It can help. One thing I'd say too is, if the anxiety is ramping up and people are freaking out, at that point you can't force it through. Like, um, you can't kind of force the kid to basically, in the midst of that agitation, get all the work done and still expect them to learn anything. If the anxiety goes up, they're not going to learn anything, even if by a miracle you happen to get the task completed anyway. So, in as much as anxiety is relatively low, that's going to increase the chance of learning. And so I always tell parents, if you're having a situation where you're getting a lot of meltdowns because of anxiety and stress and they're freaking out, do whatever you have to do to bring the anxiety down and still do as much as you can. But that might mean compromising, or kind of coming up with negotiating and coming up with an agreement about maybe getting less done than we otherwise would. And so, for example, if we have 30 math problems to do and the kid starts working on the first one and then they get stuck and they freak out and they're crying and they break their pencil and stuff like that, 30 math problems are not going to happen. And so at that point, maybe it's easier to say, hey, I'll tell you what, if you do these two and I'll help you, then I'll give you the answers for the rest. Or maybe that's not the best example, but negotiating like that so that there's still something that gets done and something that happens while keeping the anxiety lower and feeling more manageable, that's going to get you further than trying to force through those 30 math problems, which is going to be like a 3-hour battle or whatever. So feel free to step in and kind of compromise if you have to. And I'm not saying that you're not going to have them do anything, but it's better to get something done than have a tremendous battle when there's no learning that's going to happen anyway. There's going to be times where kids are going to take advantage of that and they're going to kind of work the system. That's okay. It's going to happen. But again, it's in the big picture of things, it's still going to allow for more to get done with less battles, less headache for everyone than if we're trying to kind of force everything through. But maybe you're going to negotiate not necessarily on the amount of work, but maybe how much help you're going to provide, or maybe you're going to do it differently, or maybe we're going to break things up into kind of smaller work periods, and we're going to kind of incentivize each of those work periods. So it's whatever you have to do to kind of keep the anxiety low and keep the kid at least engaged in as much as they can. You have to do that, or else nothing's going to happen anyway.
Okay, that's helpful. I know something that has helped with our son is that his school implemented was, if you're with your parents and you work really hard for 20 minutes and give it your all, then you can be done. And so that really motivated him to work really hard and be all in and lower his anxiety, because he knew he wasn't going to be stuck there forever. So I have a question for James, because if you're seeing something, you're wondering what it is, this question is, where should I go for an evaluation and what should I expect from an evaluation?
Yeah. And so there's different people that can do evaluations. The evaluations can be done in the school, like in public school. Sometimes it can be hard to get schools to do an evaluation. It depends on basically how much you're struggling. And it probably varies from country to country, from state to state. But like, for example, here in Texas, it can be difficult to get a kid evaluated if they're still getting passing grades. And now the grades might be really low and they're struggling and it's really hard. But, if you're passing, sometimes it can be hard to get that to happen. But School districts can do evaluations, and if they do agree to do it, then sometimes that can be helpful. Part of the problem is, though, is that if schools tend to be kind of formulaic in how they do evaluations, and so sometimes if you don't kind of neatly fit their formula, then the problem isn't necessarily acknowledged. The other problem that we run across is with school district evaluations, they evaluate you to tell you whether you qualify or not. They don't necessarily do an evaluation to tell you what's going on. And so there could be some limitations to that. Now, other people that can do evaluations can be psychologists or neuropsychologists, like in private practice or like at hospitals or that sort of thing. And those evaluations tend to be more focused on, okay, what's the problem and what's then the plan to address it. The downside of those kinds of evaluations are it can be hard to find somebody to do that. Depends on where you live. Sometimes they can be pretty expensive. Now, typically, they should be covered by insurance if the person doing the evaluation knows how to code it correctly when they're submitting the claims. But there can be, it can be pretty expensive if it's not covered by insurance. There are, in some cases, people who might be not necessarily like a psychologist, but they might do academic evaluations because maybe they have a master's degree in education. So they might be called like learning specialists or reading specialists. Sometimes they can do that. So it kind of depends on, it varies a lot from state to state. In terms of like anxiety or attention problems, that can usually be psychologists or psychiatrists can do those kinds of evaluations. In some cases, child neurologists. Sometimes counselors will do those evaluations, but that can vary highly as far as kind of, is it an evaluation or is it more kind of focused on doing therapy? Because that's not always the same question.
So that the kind of a follow-up to that, you touched on it a little bit, but where do we go for medication options? And once you share that, I'd love, Stephanie, if you could just kind of share how your process to explore medication options.
It depends on what kind of medicine you're talking about. Most pediatricians nowadays they'll manage medication for attention problems. I still run across a few who don't, but most of them do that nowadays. Sometimes they might want someone else to do an evaluation first, and then they'll take over the medicine. But that's usually kind of a good go-to thing that I recommend to people, is just try to start with a pediatrician because they tend to know the kid better. It's easier to get in to see them. It's less expensive. It's just easier in general. But if your pediatrician doesn't do that sort of thing, or if they don't feel comfortable with it just because of medical complications and stuff like that, then you're probably talking about either a child psychiatrist or maybe like child neurologist. Medication for anxiety is probably less likely to be something that pediatricians would do. I do see some who do, but it's less common. In most cases, you're probably talking about a child psychiatrist by and large.
Stephanie, can you share a little?
Yes, so we had been working with a child psychiatrist with Sam since about 8th grade. We were struggling with the ADHD medications. They weren't really covering him well, and we were trying to figure out the best fit for him. And that was at the point where we really discovered that Sam was also having an issue with anxiety. This doctor was not familiar with working with Duchenne patients and didn't always understand that anxiety doesn't look like typical worry. For boys with Duchenne, it can sometimes look like irritability or rigidity, rigid thoughts. It just looks like a lot of different things, even sort of paranoia sometimes, thinking that everything's aimed at them. And we worked with this psychiatrist, and really with some learning issues and with medication. And Sam just kept continuing to struggle in school and continue to struggle and tweaked things, and other doctors were recommending that we change his anxiety meds, and this doctor was not receptive to that. So finally I talked her into changing it over a summer, but then we changed it to the medication that his other doctors were recommending, but she would not increase the dose. And she kept saying, if we could just get the school situation under control, then everything else will fall into place. but really it was an anxiety issue, and it didn't look like it, but that was the overriding issue for Sam, was anxiety. And we had to switch doctors in January, in the middle of his senior year, because the doctor we were working with was just no longer listening and responding, and wasn't really hearing our concerns and recommendations from other doctors that knew Sam well, including his neurologist. So we had to switch doctors, and the doctor that we're working with now, again, not familiar with Duchenne, but has heard us and heard Sam and understands, and is working on titrating his medication up. And he's a whole new person now that the anxiety is getting under control. He's much more social, he has confidence. He's not functioning at just a living level anymore. He's able to move up to that next level in life of, you know, taking care of business and being more independent. It's really been so changing for Sam, and that's just been since January. So it was so hard to switch doctors, especially after such a long history, but it was honestly one of the best things that we could have done for Sam, and I'm glad we did.
And I think you make a good point, Steph, that it's probably going to be hard for people to find a mental health person who has a lot of experience with Duchenne, or who knows Duchenne. But it's really important to at least find someone who's willing to learn about it and listen, and really get input from other people. That's going to be vitally important. And I think that's probably more kind of something to shoot for than if people are only going to kind of try to look for somebody who's an expert in Duchenne. It's going to be pretty hard to find that.
Okay, we have another question. How do we plan, and I'm going to send this one to James. How do we plan for next year if schools don't reopen in the fall, especially for the kids requiring extra help?
Yeah. Boy, yeah, thanks for giving me an easy one. I don't know, honestly. I mean, just because of the situation, it has not suspended any of the disability laws or special education laws. I mean, schools, that's a civil rights issue, and schools are still required to address that. I think they're not sure how to do that, and I don't know if I necessarily have a definitive answer to that either. I think that there's a lot that's going to happen between now and then, hopefully. So there may be other options, or schools may be able to plan for that. But I think that the one thing that I can tell parents is that you want to try to be a little bit. You want to at least stay in conversation with school personnel. I mean, I think right now we can't get necessarily kind of too. We can't be too combative and too kind of put too much pressure right now in a way that's going to be counterproductive. But by staying in conversation with them and kind of staying on the radar and say, hey, we're still here, we need help, we want to work with you about how to put this in place, I think right now that's probably the best approach. I don't know if I have a more specific answer, though, because I think everybody's trying to figure that out. And I think it's going to be tough because our kids also don't fit they're kind of an extra level beyond kind of their typical special ed kid. So if schools are basically in a position where they are, planning on reopening at school on a limited basis, I'm not so sure that our kids are going to be able to do that. And so if they're planning for their special ed kids or their kids who need extra support, if they're planning, or if their plan is based on the assumption that people are going to be going at least part-time, and our kids aren't like that, then that plan is not going to work for us. The problem is, though, is that I don't know to what extent that's going to also fall under like their homebound educational requirements, because usually that is approved if you have an acute medical condition that makes you too sick to go to school, essentially. But this isn't like that. It's more kind of like, well, obviously we have Duchenne, but we're not going to school because we don't want to get sick. And I don't know how people are going to respond to that.
Yeah, I think, it's important to stay connected just to what your rights are and to advocate, because we're going into a new situation here. And I'm sure that, Parent Project is going to be on the forefront of helping us navigate that. But it will be a new experience just with school in the fall and what that's going to look like, and how our rights with our kids will work in terms of sending them to school, not sending them to school, and things like that. So another question, this is for Stephanie, is um, when you're at home with your kids working on schooling, and if your Duchenne kid is taking 75% of your time, how do you balance with the other siblings, their needs, doing their schoolwork and things like that?
Oh, wow. I don't know that we have we have found the balance. I certainly don't have as much time to do the things I need to do at home anymore, now that I'm having to help kids with work. We have a loose schedule in our house that we kind of all develop together, and it has times listed on it because that's what my second grader works best with. But it's more kind of an order of how we get things done in the day. And that schedule has some flexibility built into it. Like at 11 o'clock every day, it's creative time for my 8-year-old. And I didn't realize what an incentive that was going to be for her, because she watches the clock literally and waits for that time, but she can get some academic stuff done before we get there. And so she'll come sometimes push herself a little bit. But then if she's got creative time from 11 to 12, then that gives me the flexibility to go help Sam or do something else that needs to get done. So just kind of an order of things to get done in the day. Sam really resisted schedule, but that's kind of helped all of us just to have a loose schedule, not to the detailed moment, except for Sophie, who goes for the detailed moment.
Mhm. James, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, and I guess my response would be that there's no way to make it balanced. I mean, it is what it is, right? And I think that everybody, when you have a special needs kid in the family, everybody has to sacrifice for that to some extent. Now, I think what you can do is make sure that you're trying to kind of even up the sacrifice rather than kind of designate the parenting energy that everyone is getting. In the sense that, if one kid's getting 75% and the others are getting 30%, well, maybe you got to kind of sacrifice some of the time for the special needs kid in order to, devote a little bit more time to the other kids. And so there's going to be some stuff that you don't get done, but there's also going to be stuff you don't get done with everybody. And so I think it kind of goes back to what I said before about just shoot for good enough. Shoot for a bare minimum if you have to, and don't feel like, to be a good parent, you have to give the best case scenario to everyone, because it's not going to happen. And then, there's also, well, if you're exerting 75% of your time to your special needs kid and 30% of your time and energy to the other kid, well, what about you? So, we have to take care of ourselves as well. And so don't shoot for good, shoot for good enough. And don't feel guilty if you do kind of have to sacrifice some things, but don't feel guilty if you have to sacrifice some things for your special need kid too, in order to help the others and take care of yourself.
Okay, that's great. And just a word that next week we're actually focusing on siblings. I'm going to have some siblings here, and Jill Castle will be working on some things just with us with how to work with our siblings. So I encourage you to tune in for that next week. As we get ready to close up, I want to ask James and Stephanie just to give you guys a word of encouragement and realize this is hard. What we're doing right now is hard. I know for me, sometimes with my Duchenne kid, sending them to school was a little break for me, and just a break that we both needed. And so now we don't get that break. But this is a time for any family is challenging, but for our families, it's extra challenging. And I hope that you're offering yourselves grace in that. But I just want to ask James and then Stephanie, like, what word of encouragement do you have for us as we're in the trenches doing this?
Stephanie, you first. I still have to think of what to say.
So I would say, just aim to get as much done as you can. We're not trying to be Pinterest families or Facebook photo families. We're just trying to survive, and it does not have to look pretty. I feed my kids. I make sure that they have what they need. We try to get some academics done. We try to have make sure that everybody's mental health is good, and everything else right now is just fluff. Fortunately, this is not going to last forever, and maybe we'll learn some valuable skills that we can take forward in life.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And what I would kind of even add to that, and I would say, you can use this, you can view this situation entirely as a difficult scenario, entirely as something that is a huge inconvenience and stressful and disrupted everything and caused huge problems, which it all is, right? But at the same time, you can also use this opportunity for positive things too, like during this time, make a commitment to spend more family time together, to connect more, and to not necessarily have to worry about all the stuff you got to get done, but use it for kind of positive connections and be okay with that. And again, kind of like Steph was saying, just don't feel like you have to be perfect. Just shoot for good enough, and things will change. And actually, when they change back, you'll probably realize maybe there was some aspects of this that you miss. Now, again, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it or wear rose-colored glasses or anything like that. I know it's tough, but look. We find that people tend to cope best with difficult situations if they can also find a positive aspect to their difficult situation. So try to find that if you can. And even if you have to kind of challenge yourself a bit to do that.
Those are all great words. Thank you so much, James and Stephanie, for this. And just like to remind you that on the Parent Project website, there are a ton of resources to help you with learning. If you're, maybe this is the first time you've thought about this with your kids, that maybe they might have some learning challenges. I invite you to go to Parent Project and look at those resources, and obviously reach out as well. We're here to support you and walk with you. This is a big stressor in Duchenne that sometimes gets overlooked by families. They're just kind of trying to keep up with everything and don't have time to work on this. But I encourage you, if you're seeing some learning issues, to reach out and maybe try to get some answers, because that may help your overall family life and the life of your child as well. So thank you so much, and we will see you again next Friday. Remember, we're going to be talking with some siblings, so it's going to be just a great conversation. Thank you.